It feels like most Sonic fans, be they classic or modern, became fans when they were kids and thereby grew up with a certain era of the franchise. Despite being rather obsessed with Sonic, I don't think I'm one of those people. Sure, there was a Sonic 2 cabinet in my dentist's office that I would sometimes play while waiting for my appointment, but that was at best only 1 or 2 times a year, and I didn't even know how to get past the first boss fight. Not an uncommon experience, I hear. It wasn't until late 2018 that I started on the path of beating almost every mainline installment, and since that was relatively recent, my personal connection to the series isn't as deep-rooted as it is for a lot of other people who talk about it. I'm not saying this to act like my opinion is the end-all be-all or anything, I just wanted to say that to preface whatever I talk about with this series. I also think the issue of nostalgia and what era you prefer or grew up with plays a part in the discussion of Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2. As I've mentioned in an earlier video, there's been plenty of interest in these two games over the past few years, to a point where this video might be lost to the hodgepodge of online Sonic Adventure analysis that exists, and it's hard to come up with a good stance as a result. That's not going to stop me from making this video though, as I don't want to break the promise I made last year. Besides, it's worth considering why they're so talked about in the first place. The series is very different from how it was when these games came out, yet they're still pivotal in the grand scheme of things, and a lot of people grew up with them. Naturally, plenty of people would want to return to this era in some way, and it could benefit the series if it was done right. How well do I actually believe they hold up, considering the fact that I didn't grow up with them? And what about them could have been improved in a follow-up game? Well, get ready, because it's finally time for me to dive into the two Sonic Adventure games. Apparently, one of the most notable reasons that the adventure games are as popular as they are is their stories. While most platformers prior to 1998 had stories that could be told with 2-minute long intro and ending scenes, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 have relatively complex stories told through numerous dialogue-filled cutscenes sprinkled throughout the game. Clearly, there was an effort to push what the series and maybe even the platformer genre was capable of, and I have a lot of respect for their efforts here. With that said, I don't consider myself the person to turn to for a highly nuanced analysis of if, how, and why these stories do or don't work, and I wouldn't say that contributes a lot to how much I enjoy the games. I apologize if I disappoint any of you by saying that I'm not going to go too deep into this topic, but for what this video is trying to do, a thorough plot summary for both would be a bit redundant. There are still points that I want to go over regardless though. What stuck out to me about Sonic Adventure when I first played it was that it felt like a natural extension of the classic games that I had just played at the time, referencing events from Sonic 2, CD, and 3. SA2 meanwhile seemed to only reference SA1 in rather short intervals. It can be a little weird seeing Sonic jump out of a military helicopter or have his edgy red and black counterpart sealed away as part of a government cover-up if you're just coming off the game's gold. Personally, I wasn't all that bothered by this since, and this applies to both games, the characters themselves generally weren't a huge departure from what the previous games established, and said previously established characters still play a vital role in the story. People also like to bring up plot holes, but I don't think they make the story collapse on itself like some suggest. If all you had to do was change Shadow's design to look more like Sonic for the plot point of the military confusing the two to make sense, then I'd be hard pressed to call it a fundamental issue. Also, fun fact, bats in real life can't fly upside down. While I'm willing to defend the plot points themselves, the way they're connected in these games feels odd. I don't know if it's just me, but Adventure 2 tends to feel like it's jumping from one thing to another too quickly, and key elements feel like they should have more impact than they actually do in the games. For example, I like how Shadow gets a deeper respect for Sonic after realizing he did Chaos Control with a fake emerald, but the last time they met was in the jungle half the story ago, and they barely think about each other in the meantime. It's kinda weird that the game just suddenly brings this back up at the end of the Hero and Dark story. I'm not sure if Adventure 1 is quite as bad in this regard, since the goal is at least consistently clear for each character, but it does have issues like how the story of Chaos is told through flashbacks that have little to do with the events that are happening when they're shown. Though again, story analysis isn't my forte, so I could just be talking nonsense here. I think most of us can agree that in terms of the actual cutscene presentation, Sonic Adventure 2 has the clear advantage. The voice acting is overall better in Adventure 2, though I wouldn't call it terrible in either game. What is terrible is the animation and cinematography in SA1. Even beyond Adventure 1's hilariously bad-looking mouth movements, the pacing of these cutscenes feels very sluggish with needlessly long spaces between lines, and you're not even allowed to skip these in the Dreamcast version, though I haven't played through that version. As early as Sonic Adventure 2's hero story intro, intro cutscene, you can already tell that there were more resources put into these cutscenes as you get a smooth looking shot of an upside down Sonic flashing a grin towards the camera from the side of his face. That said, SA2's presentation, while maybe less jarring, is still a bit janky in some sense. Since these cutscenes were made with the Japanese dialogue in mind, the lip syncing and timing on certain lines is pretty off, not to mention that the sound mixing in the HD versions is almost as bad as my Kirby's Adventure video. This is an aspect where both games have aged, but I can accept that as a standard of the time, and it's sometimes funny. I just think SA2's presentation is more pleasant to watch simply because it has a better understanding of pacing. I suppose that all doesn't really make a difference though, the gameplay is all that matters, right? Well, not exactly. If you ask me, one reason these games are so memorable is their music. Starting with Sonic Adventure, many consider this game's soundtrack to be one of, if not the greatest in the entire series, which really says a lot. Personally, I wouldn't go that far, but credit is definitely due for being the point in the main series, not counting CD, where the music could spread its wings, no longer being bound by the limited sound hardware of the Sega Genesis. Despite that, listening back to the music now, the only thing I can say to describe this soundtrack as a whole is unapologetically late 90s Sega. The soundtrack likes to utilize the electric guitar, intense saxophones, and various synth instruments, creating tracks that often have a powerful attitude, while also having many tracks that strike a different mood, such as the haunting sounds in Lost World, or the more playful tunes of Twinkle Park. Heck, that last one is a remix of an unused track from Sonic 3D Blast, and there are a few other tracks that pay tribute to that game's music, it being one of Jun Tsunoi's first music contributions to the Sonic franchise. Most of the time, Sonic Adventure's music captures the mood of the locations excellently, but the music of Adventure 2 goes in a different direction completely. It's more focused on the characters, meaning that the style of music used in each stage depends on which character goes through it. For some examples, Knuckles' stages use hip-hop music with good sounding beats but kinda on the nose lyrics. While Rouge's stages are more jazzy with gibberish vocals. Most of the others have some variation on rock, which some people have criticized, even more so than the first Sonic Adventure. And to my ears, this soundtrack does get knocked down a couple ticks due to less in variety. On an individual level though, there really aren't many tracks that I can say I don't care for. The instrumentation sounds cohesive and perhaps even more sophisticated than Adventure 1's. And the compositions are consistently pretty sick and don't sound like generic rock music by any means. Trust me, I've heard games with generic rock music before, and Sonic Adventure 2's tracks are still addicting to listen to. Overall, both soundtracks are bangers, but what else is new with Sonic? The first thing you'll notice about the gameplay is that both games are split up into multiple different campaigns, 6 primary ones in Sonic Adventure and 2 in Sonic Adventure 2. However, both these games actually have 6 characters each. In Sonic Adventure's case, this means that each playable character has his or own campaign. Sonic's story is easily the longest though, with the most and biggest stages. In Sonic Adventure 2's case, the stories and playstyles are more balanced, with each stage being similar in length no matter the playstyle, and with each style having around 10 stages, but more on those later. If you don't enjoy one or two of the playstyles, then this structure might hinder you, since you're forced to play all three styles to reach the end of one of these stories. If you only care about the Sonic portions of Sonic Adventure, then you don't have to bother with anything else, whereas in Sonic Adventure 2, those who want more Sonic and Shadow portions will have to plow through the other playstyles to get more of their levels. Most future 3D Sonic games with multiple playstyles would take Adventure 2's approach of forcing you to use them all to progress though, so I don't think Sonic Team considered it to inherently be a huge issue in the long run. That said, maybe the structure could be rethought into something akin to Super Mario 64 or Galaxy, where every mission is technically optional but still valuable for finishing the game. That way you can choose to prioritize playing the speed levels if you want, but there's still a reason to mess with the other gameplay styles. I mean, the emblem system already seems to be inspired by the Power Stars, doesn't it? Perhaps a less linear progression would mess with the greater story focus that the adventure games are known for, but it's not like the structure the games already have doesn't negatively impact the story in any way. Adventure 1's approach often results in you having to rewatch cutscenes if you're playing all the stories, while each story in Adventure 2 has you shifting between multiple characters, which might play into why I think the story tends to feel like it's shifting its focus too quickly. Speaking of shifting focus, we're getting a bit sidetracked. The other notable difference in structure between the two games is that Sonic Adventure has hub areas, or adventure fields as the game calls them, while Sonic Adventure 2 doesn't. Basically, between levels you wander around the game world to trigger the next cutscene and or reach the next level or boss fight. I think there's a certain appeal to being able to slow down for a bit to interact with the world around you. It's one thing that people liked about the classic Sonic games. You didn't always have to constantly move forward quickly, but could slow down to explore for stuff. In Sonic Adventure's case, there's plenty of charm here with subplots to follow throughout the story and people reacting to the events around them, making this world feel more real. With that said, if you aren't interested in interacting with NPCs and whatnot, these adventure fields can feel like a needless waste of time between levels. In that case, all you're really doing is moving from point A to point B with little challenge, besides occasionally putting keys into holes, which is just mundane on repeat playthroughs. On your first playthrough, there might be some sense of intrigue and puzzle solving, but even then, you also might not be sure how to progress. After you beat a level, it's not always self-explanatory what you need to do next to advance the story. There are floating red orbs to guide you along, as well as NPCs that can give you the general idea of where to go next, but this still might take some time for a first-timer to piece together. Thankfully, they're not too hard to figure out, especially since the BX versions give you a map, but they still don't serve all that much gameplay purpose. Both games follow a linear progression in each individual story, meaning that there's no room to play stages in the order you please, but the buffer between stages stays, with nothing you can do about it. I can see why SA2 removed them, but at the same time, I don't want to say that they added nothing. They did good in contextualizing the stages and letting the player get to know the world the characters live in. I guess the world map in SA2 fulfills a similar purpose, but it doesn't let you become familiar with the world and its inhabitants the same way Adventure 1 does. If the adventure fields were more tightly designed to reduce the time it takes to get from point to point, and or the game structure was more loose as I've suggested, then we wouldn't have to worry about the gameplay detriments. The other 3D Sonic games with similar hub worlds are incidentally the ones I haven't played though, so I can't say how much they actually improved on the idea. A related aspect that's actually present in both games is upgrading your character. In SA1, these were mostly relegated to hub worlds, which unfortunately makes the issue of them being a needless buffer between levels a little worse. There are times where, in order to progress, you need to scour these places looking for something that may or may not be useful for the rest of the game. There are also upgrades that aren't forced on the player but rather encourage exploration in the hub worlds, and while these aren't always the most useful either, they're at least harmless because they aren't forced. SA2's removal of hubs means that all upgrades are placed in stages, and the ones that are required are often placed along the beaten path in some way. That's good for better game pacing, but there's still the issue of how useful abilities aren't available until you're a ways into the game. Sand Ocean in particular is more of a hassle in a normal playthrough than it is when going for the A ranks, since you don't have the hover ability and are forced to wait for slow moving platforms. I think that the player should be given everything they technically need to finish the game right from the start, but optional upgrades could still be placed around the stages and or adventure fields to encourage exploration. Maybe there could even be a system where you're allowed to customize which enhancements to equip before playing the stage, sort of like the skill system from Sonic Generations. While they're at it, the upgrades themselves should be more consistently useful. There's only like one good place to use the magic hands in the entirety of Sonic Adventure 2, and the sunglasses and treasure scope are only good for the hard mode missions. With that said, let's get into the individual playstyles, starting with the speed gameplay. Often regarded as the highlight of both adventure games, it attempts to translate the elements of the classic Sonic gameplay into a 3D space, which should hopefully be a good thing considering how much of a kick I get out of playing the classic games. Just like in the days of old, Sonic and Shadow have to get from point A to point B, destroying robots, collecting rings, and blazing through loops and other similar set pieces while doing so. In terms of base movement, they control about how you'd expect if you've played the classics, meaning that acceleration to top speed is gradual, the jump is very adjustable in both its height and direction, although it's somewhat floatier than before, and slopes affect your movement in the way you would expect. Turning feels snappy no matter how fast you run, which feels incredibly smooth at low or moderate speeds, but feels a bit sensitive when using the spin dash or when boost pads propel you at high speeds. Maybe I'm only complaining there because I've only ever played these games on a keyboard, meaning that I have no analog control, but it says a lot that even with only 8 directions, the movement control in these games is otherwise spot on and makes simple movement satisfying, at least for Sonic and Shadow. It hits that sweet spot where it's not too stiff or sluggish, but also not too slippery or sensitive, allowing for incredibly high precision, and it's a shame that pretty much every future 3D Sonic game misses that sweet spot in one way or another. In the transition to 3D, there did have to be some changes to the gameplay. The spin dash is charged by holding the action button, even when you're already running, rather than mashing it like in the classic games, and it seems to give you more speed than it did before. Maybe they could have balanced it more to retain the element of earning speed or whatever, but I don't mind it too much. Besides that, you have the homing attack, which negates the precision that would otherwise be needed to hit enemies, item boxes, and springs. While one might say that this dumbs the gameplay down, I don't really feel like precision in hitting enemies was a major focus of the classic games. The challenge more so came from using the right attack and not accidentally bumping into their attacks, which is something that these games understand pretty decently. I'll definitely take this over clumsily trying to roll into or jump on ambiguous hitboxes in a 3D space. The only other notable mechanic that Sonic Adventure adds is the light speed dash, which lets you blaze along a trail of rings. While it always works when you want it to in Sonic Adventure, it's not very satisfying to use since you have to spend a few seconds charging it up. Sonic Adventure 2 makes it activate as soon as the action button is pressed, and this allows it to have more utility, like having sections dedicated to timing your light speed dash correctly, or even giving a burst of speed if there's a row of rings on the ground. Regrettably, it can also occasionally not work when you want it to, which can result in you using a different move. This could have been fixed by giving the light speed dash its own button, but that sadly isn't the case here. This is a bit of a theme with the mechanics that Adventure 2 adds for Sonic. They're fun to use when they work, but that's sadly not all the time. First up is the somersault, which can be used to break through boxes and enemy defenses. At low speeds, this is useful for combat since some enemies resist the homing attack, and the spin dash might not be ideal to use if you don't have solid footing. The issue is that it shares the same button as the spin dash in a way that feels clunky. The somersault only activates when you let go of the button and not when you press it, and the spin dash only begins its charge after you hold the button for a second. As a result, both moves feel unresponsive. This would later be improved in Shadow the Hedgehog of all games, which makes it so that the spin dash activates instantly from a standstill while the slide activates while in motion, though ideally they'd be mapped to separate buttons so you could still do the standard somersault from a standstill. The other mechanics are better but not perfect. The bounce attack can occasionally betray you since it's mapped to the same button as the light speed dash, but when it works it's pretty fun and useful, allowing you to reach higher areas, extend homing attack chains for bigger point bonuses, and hit rails at high speeds. Oh yeah, rails. That's another mechanic that Adventure 2 adds. While some people seem to hate the rail grinding mechanic and believe it just amounts to hold B to win, in this game I don't have a problem with it. The rails help to keep the pace moving forward, but to make the most of them, the player has to crouch to gain speed and nudge the analog stick to keep balance. The biggest issue with it that I can think of is that switching between rails can be a bit of a gamble. Occasionally, you can go flying off to your death for something that should be relatively simple. This is another mechanic that later saw more polish in Shadow the Hedgehog, where rail switching is more natural and works more consistently, although the balancing mechanic is sadly no longer present. Now, while I've so far mostly dissected how Adventure 2's mechanics are somewhat unreliable, this sort of jank is an issue that both Adventure games have to some extent. Stuff like clipping through level geometry or the camera completely freaking out, certain stage mechanics not working properly. There are so many little niggles that I don't feel like getting into. Now before you tell me, well, if you played the original Dreamcast version you wouldn't run into all these issues, I want to clarify that I can understand things being rough around the edges for a speed, physics-centric 3D games made around the turn of the 21st century, and moreover, I don't think it's even close to severe enough to render these games unplayable. Sure, stuff happens and it's not always your fault, but I can suck it up and move on, especially since these games feel more forgiving of mistakes than the classics for several reasons. Consistent autosaving, pits and spikes being easier to predict, crushers not instantly killing you, the camera actually giving you a decent view of what's ahead, the final boss actually having rings, being able to jump out of knockback, etc. To me, dying sometimes in unexpected ways in these games really isn't all that grating. I also spent more time on Adventure 2 in this regard because the issues there are more so baked into the mechanics. I am aware that there are mods to fix many of these issues, but I didn't want to use them. I could chalk it up to authenticity, but the real reason is that there's also a weird rendering bug on my PC that causes 2D effects in the game to be invisible by default. Fixing this involves changing file names and subsequently making the game incompatible with mods, so I just chose not to use the mods. Mods aside, my first playthroughs of both of these games are recent enough that I can remember roughly how much the glitch factor affected the experience. It's hard to ignore, but I consider both games very playable to this day no matter the version, though Sonic Adventure 2 can be a pretty rough experience your first go around thanks to the aforementioned issues with Sonic and Shadow's gameplay. Figured that now would be a good time to bring that up. Back on topic though, the level design philosophy of the Sonic stages changed a bit between the two games. Most of the levels in Adventure 1 start off by plopping you in, while most of Adventure 2's levels start by thrusting you forward, and that about sets the tone for most of the level design in these games. It's no surprise that Adventure 1's levels feel more open and loose, while Adventure 2's feel like tight obstacle courses. With Sonic Adventure, the levels are definitely more linear than the classic games in the sense that there aren't many differing paths from point A to point B. What it may lack in branching paths though, it makes up for with the abundance of shortcuts to take using the spin dash, made possible thanks to the amount of slopes in these stages. On the surface, this might just come off as exploiting the game's archaic mechanics in unintended ways, or breaking the game as the kids like to call it. That said, while I don't know if the developers were aware of all these skips, they clearly were aware that it was possible to exploit the stages in this way because in some instances they actually encourage it, and I can't help but commend that. A casual player probably wouldn't think twice about these buildings at the beginning of Speed Highway, but if you spin dash up them, you'll find extra lives at the top. You think a developer would place those there for no reason? And in Twinkle Park, after getting off the roller coaster, you're normally sent down this tube to begin the level, but if you go behind the train, you'll actually land on a platform that you can use to reach a later part of the level. Why else would that platform be there other than to allow the player a potential speedrun strat? There are plenty of secrets and shortcuts that are obtained in similar ways, and in this sense, the early 3D roughness actually works to this game's benefit. While Sonic Adventure 2 has some secrets obtained by thinking outside the box, it's nonetheless to a much lesser degree than Adventure 1. This might sound like a negative at first, but in some ways there's more involved to being skilled at Adventure 2. While most of Adventure 1's skill involves spin dash jumping in some way, in Adventure 2 you'll have to reach certain grind rails, time tricks on ramps and horizontal bars, jump through hoops, light speed dash correctly, and more. It makes it feel like there's far more to interact with and master compared to SA1. The game also makes combat more involved with more aggressive and defensive enemies. Sometimes you'll need to use the somersault to get under a shield, while other times you need to hit the enemy squarely in the head before it attacks you with its arms. The stages are more about maintaining your rhythm and balance through a singular route than about finding the best route through complex geometry, and thankfully the game supports that philosophy with tight pacing. While not as blisteringly fast as the later Boost games, the levels are about constant action and forward momentum with very little time where you're forced to stop or wait around, but it's not completely mindless either since, as I've said, you're given plenty to master. Compared to, say, Sonic 1, where the most linear zones were also the slowest, I'd say that this is an improvement. I like to think of these as 3D Donkey Kong Country levels, if that makes any sense. Thing is, this is Sonic and not Donkey Kong, so needless to say, this is a bit of a different approach compared to Adventure 1. I really can't say that either approach is better per se, and I think that says a lot about how versatile the Adventure playstyle is. It can support both of these types of levels without feeling unnatural or forced. It would be nice if they were able to encompass this entire spectrum in one game though, having some stages be more expansive and loose with others feeling more linear and kinetic. With 10 speed levels per game, that doesn't sound like too much to ask, does it? If the control scheme was an improved version of Sonic Adventure 2's, that would be even better. The added mechanics would raise the skill ceiling even further from Adventure 1, and polishing them more would allow for more challenging stages. Of course, in both games, Sonic's gameplay is only one piece of the pie. Tails has been Sonic's bro for life for a couple games now, so it would only be natural for him to enter the third dimension as well, right? For a while, this was considered one of the best styles in Sonic Adventure, but that opinion seems to have soured over time. Tails' general movement is about as good as Sonic's in this game, albeit without a spin dash or homing attack. Tails retains the ability to fly much like in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but with rather mixed results this time. His flight is a lot more controllable than it was in the classic games, only requiring holding the button as opposed to mashing it, and feeling more snappy. While his flight feels good to use, the levels don't do a very good job accommodating it since they're almost always shared with Sonic. When you're not redoing the same gameplay that you previously experienced as Sonic, you're usually just mindlessly sailing over the landscape beneath you. For the most part, the only changes in the levels are the addition of dash rings, which only allow you to break the levels even further. As a result, the levels often don't require you to actually utilize the environment in any substantial way, which is the key difference between skipping levels as Tails and skipping them as Sonic. With Sonic, spin dash jump skips were a result of the terrain being used to your advantage, while with Tails, you can just ignore everything and gun it for the end. This lack of interaction with the stages, I think, is the core issue with Tails' gameplay. The appeal from the other playstyles in this game is generally supposed to be interacting with the same environments in different ways. With that in mind, having Tails just skip over everything with no effort doesn't play into that appeal, and neither does playing the stages the same way as I would with Sonic. To combat this issue, the designers gave Tails' gameplay the added challenge of making you race against Sonic, but you wanna know something? I think this just makes the issue worse. As I've mentioned, some of the appeal of classic Sonic gameplay was that you can either see how quickly you can clear the stages, or you can take your time and explore. Even Sonic's gameplay in SA1 has plenty of this. Tails' gameplay could have taken it to the logical extreme by letting you use Tails' flight in whatever way you want, but instead the pressure to beat Sonic to the goal actively deters you from exploring. Speed Highway in particular is tantalizing because you have the most open environment for the character, but the fact that you have to focus on beating Eggman means that you don't have a lot of time to process it. On the flip side, speeding towards the end isn't particularly engaging either, not just because Sonic isn't a particularly difficult opponent to beat, but also because the skill ceiling isn't very hard to reach. When you know that you can reach the end of Windy Valley in one big jump, it can be satisfying to pull off the first time, but you'll quickly realize that it's not hard to do, and there's no additional challenge to surpass afterwards. Not to mention that less time in the stages means proportionally more time in the adventure fields. And overall, playing as Tails in itself is palatable enough in this game by virtue of controlling well, but the actual stages feel like they go by too quickly. Besides adding an ineffectual racing mechanic, how could one make Tails less broken? Well, Sonic Adventure 2 did so by stuffing the kid in a mech, but we'll get there when we get there. The real question is how you design levels for Tails that take advantage of his flight while still making it interesting to play, but even after trying out Tails in the classic games, the answer is honestly not clear to me. Even in those games, Tails was treated as something of an easy mode, being the same as Sonic's story while allowing players to bypass certain platforming sections. Still, Tails' flight was restricted by the use of walls and ceilings, not to mention that flying was generally slower than rolling. I'm conflicted about this though. What does it say about how much flying adds to the experience that they have to limit it to make the game more engaging? Especially in Sonic 3 and Knuckles, I don't even find myself using Tails' flight that much because the levels either slow to a crawl or stop you in your tracks when you try to use it. I get the message that even in the classic games, Tails' abilities and the level design just neuter each other rather than enhance each other. The only possible exception is the robot generator side quest in Sonic CD, where searching through vertical explorative levels for signposts and machines is actually a bit more fun than with Sonic and seems to be a natural fit for a character who can fly. It's the one time where Tails is actually connecting with the environment while simultaneously feeling substantially different from Sonic. Maybe Tails' gameplay could be a 3D evolution of this? Then again, it might have a similar problem as SA1, only it's forcing exploration rather than forcing speed. The moral of the story is, I really ought to try out that mod of SA2 that gives Tails' SA1 playstyle. On the topic of forcing exploration, Knuckles was another playable character in the previous main series game and enters the 3D realm alongside Sonic and Tails. Despite his fists being a prominent part of his design, the Red Echidna's playstyle was never much about digging or punching things, though SA1 does introduce those. Instead, he was set apart from Sonic by his ability to glide through the air and climb walls, both of which carried over to Sonic Adventure. The difference this time is that the objective is no longer just to reach the end of the stage, but instead to find 3 objects within each stage, with a radar allowing you to detect how close the objects are. The level designs for this gameplay come straight out of Sonic stages, but unlike with Tails' straightforward objectives, this ends up working very well as a shake-up of the traditional gameplay. It is still a bit short and easy since these are only sections of Sonic's levels and not the whole thing, but the levels are more sandbox-like with plenty of ways to traverse across the stage. Unlike with Tails, this playstyle encourages you to interact with the environment to find the trinkets you're looking for. The emerald shards are also placed in different locations each time you play, which can be seen as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it makes the stages more replayable since you'll have to approach them differently each time you play. On the other hand, it means that how long it takes to complete is partly dependent on luck. In the first Sonic adventure, this isn't anything to get worked up over. The levels are all pretty small and easy to navigate, and combined with the generous radar, levels don't take too long no matter the RNG you get. At the same time, I wish Knuckles' stages took a bit more time to beat, if only so that the adventure fields didn't take up so much time by comparison. Apparently this gameplay style was so promising that it was kept around for Adventure 2. While Sonic's added mechanics sometimes cluttered things up or came off as unreliable, the changes to Knuckles' and in this case Rouge's mechanics feel logical and work quite well for this gameplay. The new drill move, for example, allows you to strike the ground quicker, and you'd practically never use it unintentionally since there aren't any other mid-air B button actions. Besides that, I just think mechanics like these are satisfying to use in pretty much any game since they help it feel that much faster and means that you have control in the downwards direction. Hitting the ground with this allows you to dig, and this feels far more elegant and less pace-breaking than the digging in Sonic Adventure. You can even dig into walls in this game, which sees use for getting some of the emerald shards. To address the elephant in the room, yes, the radar has been nerfed in this game. While in Adventure, it would detect all 3 objects at a time, in Adventure 2 it can only detect a specific one. From a certain perspective, I can understand this as a design choice. It aligns with the new hint system, which gives text-based hints depending on which object you're looking for. Maybe there could have been an upgrade to let you detect the other 2 objects. I'm sure it'd be more useful than sunglasses, but I can somewhat understand why they made the radar the way it is. What I don't quite understand is how vague the radar is regarding your distance from an object. While in Sonic Adventure, the radar would shift between 5 different colors and beep at any rate it possibly could, in Adventure 2 it only has 3 different colors and beeps at a rate completely dependent on the color. This is honestly more bothersome to me as it makes it less clear whether or not you're getting closer to a desired object. You could definitely argue that SA1's radar was too generous, but they might have gone a bit too far in the other direction in the sequel. So the radar in SA2 could be considered a downgrade, but I'd say the level design is an upgrade. To start, each treasure hunting stage in the game is memorable with distinct structure and set pieces. Sometimes you'll be raising and lowering the water level to access certain areas and pathways, sometimes you'll be going through corridors while trying to avoid being spotted by security robots. Other stages are more standard with a straightforward emphasis on gliding around open areas, but they generally have more crooks and nannies to search in than the levels in SA1. I could single out specific stages that I don't like, but I honestly just appreciate that the designers were willing to shake things up for the treasure hunting. Besides, I don't think we can unanimously agree on which treasure hunting stages are good or bad, aside from maybe Mad Space being bad, but that's still a maybe. It also helps that the stages are also generally fair in their design. Hazards rarely come out of nowhere, and there are a few pits to accidentally fall into aside from Mad Space. Pumpkin Hill seems like it's suspended over a giant pit, but if you fall in, the game pushes you back up. Despite this, the skill ceiling is high as you can finish these stages very quickly if you're familiar with the layouts and use hints wisely. Perhaps you'd consider the larger levels a downgrade if you didn't want to treasure hunt in a Sonic game in the first place, but that's mostly a matter of preference rather than an objective downgrade. I think it's more fair to evaluate it based on what it wants to be rather than what I want it to be. Maybe it's easy for me to say that since I knew what I was getting into before playing this game, but in a single player campaign like this, I can roll with the punches if I think it's fun in its own right. As I've addressed, there was a certain charm to how Sonic and Knuckles interacted with the same levels in different ways, which is shamefully absent in this game. If that's the trade-off for deeper, more varied levels though, then I'll take it. Besides, SA2 does recreate that somewhat with its reuse of some level assets and geometry. You may recognize the church and mountains in Skyrail from Pumpkin Hill, just arranged in a different way. My favorite example is how Death Chamber makes use of a mechanic that was taught to you in Pyramid Cave, where you have to hit hourglasses to temporarily open doors. Heck, it's even used in the following boss fight against King Boom Boo. With that said, even though I'd make the case that all of SA2's main 3 playstyles have similar sensibilities, removing shared levels between characters does come with the side effect of making them feel more disjointed. Sonic's gameplay in SA2 downplays exploration, partially because he doesn't need to share levels with Knuckles the Explorer, and Knuckles in SA2 loses the ability to roll into a ball like Sonic. It can almost feel like you're alternating between 3 different games made by the same studio, and I can't think of any non-Sonic platformers off the top of my head that handle gameplay variety this way. Perhaps they could have remedied this by carrying over the shared levels but having more sections that are exclusive to each character. Think of what they did in SA1 but giving each character the same treatment that Sonic got. As it is, pretty much the only characters in the first Sonic adventure with sufficient emphasis on set pieces unique to them are Sonic and Amy. Speaking of Amy, she makes her playable debut in a mainline Sonic game in SA1. Her stages have the standard get to the end goal like Sonic and Tails, and the gimmick this time is that you're being chased by Zero the robot. Much like Tails' racing mechanic though, this gimmick doesn't add a whole lot. Zero is barely a threat since his punch and shockwave attacks are pretty ineffective and he can easily be pushed away with your hammer. Fortunately, unlike Tails' gameplay, Amy's stages are more than just pared down versions of Sonic's stages. As I previously said, a good portion of Amy's level design is catered towards her movement and abilities, and each Amy stage is about as long as a Sonic stage. I also like the variety of set pieces in these levels, with things like navigating halls of mirrors or platforming against giant gears. Stuff like placing colored blocks in colored holes or playing a dumb guessing game. Seriously, there should have been some visual cue in this room as to which door is the right one. It is rather mundane, but at least you're not spending too much time doing any one thing. There could have been more involved platforming, but I'd personally say what we got is enough to hold my attention through these stages. Unfortunately, Amy also brings in an issue that the previously mentioned characters don't really have: control problems. You often hear complaints saying that she moves too slow, and while I think the top speed works fine for the levels, her acceleration feels clunky compared to Sonic, Tails, or Knuckles. Unlike those characters, she can't spin, jump, or roll either, with her big Pico Pico hammer being her only method of attack. Even with the levels being designed the way they are, it can be cumbersome. These issues also make the hub world issue even worse, especially in the last part of her story, since the slower speed makes it take even longer to reach the next level. It's not like her mechanics don't have potential though. As slow as she moves, speed is still an element of this gameplay. If she's able to get to high speed, she can use the hammer flip move that allows her to jump higher, which can occasionally allow her to access small shortcuts. She only gets 3 levels to show what she can do though, and that's pretty pathetic. Sonic Adventure 2 didn't bring this gameplay back though, so we never got to see what her gameplay would look like if it were improved. I said if it were improved. There are a few directions you could go from here. Maybe Zero isn't vital to this playstyle and the level design itself should have been made more interesting instead. Maybe she could have had more acrobatic maneuvers as well. Maybe she should have been faster to make her feel better and more like Sonic, but I wonder if she would even need her own levels at that point. Tails and Knuckles don't quite work with the same levels and objectives as Sonic due to their abilities being overpowered, but Amy doesn't have any huge platforming boost besides her hammer jump. Just some food for thought. Anyways, next up is a character entirely new to the series, E102 Gamma. That's right, you get to play as one of Eggman's robots for the first time in a main series game, and this paves the way for shooting gameplay in a Sonic game. The goal is to reach the end of each stage before the time limit runs out, and you can shoot stuff to extend the time limit. By locking onto multiple targets at once, you gain far more time than if you were just mashing the action button, at the cost of being completely vulnerable until you let go of the button. This is helpful to know in theory, but in practice, well, his gameplay ultimately suffers from a similar issue as Tails'. Most of the levels are recycled from bits of Sonic's, and the challenge they tried to add on top is ineffective at hiding this. The time limit is set at 3 minutes for each Gamma stage, but who has honestly taken more than 3 minutes to beat Final Egg and Emerald Coast? An easy solution to this would have been to change the time limit depending on which stage you're playing so that you're more incentivized to destroy enemies. Even still, the stages would likely still be too short, and you can fill in the blank on why I would have an issue with that. Gamma's best level would have to be Hot Shelter since it's so meaty and feels so specifically built for him. There's parts where you ride across trains, get picked up by mechanical claws, shoot up enemies in a vertical shaft. It's good stuff. The playstyle itself had some promise, but the levels themselves don't let this gameplay reach its fullest potential. Which is where the sequel steps in. Sonic Adventure 2 brings the shooting gameplay back, and much like the treasure hunting gameplay, it has its own levels to spread its wings. hover devices in. Instead of playing as Gamma, however, you take the role of Dr. Eggman, marking his first and I think only time in the main series where he would be a major playable character. You also get to play as Tails in this mode, but only in its mech suit, the Cyclone. A lot of people really don't seem to like the fact that Tails has to be played in the mech, but, and I do apologize, I think that's painfully petty. I don't really buy that these levels would automatically be more fun to play if you were playing as anyone besides Tails in the mech. It would be like saying that the Werehog would be better if you were playing as Knuckles instead. Wait, people actually say that? The game design underneath is what matters more, and in this regard I'd say Tails has it far better in this game. For starters, heading for the end without paying attention to anything is no longer an option. The way forward is more often blocked by obstructions that either need to be destroyed or be opened by clearing the area of enemies. Gamma had some of this, but not nearly enough. I'm wondering who goes around placing all these dynamite packs though. The enemies themselves are also more aggressive, and you can't just rely on the ring system to let you ignore that since the walkers have a health bar. Take too many hits from enemies and soon you'll be out of commission. I also find the platforming and hazards to be more of a challenge to overcome than in the first game. All of this causes you to be more engaged than you were in Gamma's levels. The levels are also much longer than before, but aren't excessive, typically taking between 2 and 5 minutes like the other playstyles in SA2. Cosmic Wall is the only exception, with it taking around 7 or 8 minutes, but at least that stage is fun enough to make up for it. Unfortunately, talking about level time leads me into one of the biggest issues with the mech gameplay. In the first game, you were theoretically incentivized to destroy multiple targets at once with lock-on missiles so that your time limit would increase. The second game removes this time limit, meaning that locking onto chains of robots doesn't help you in beating the stage. There is a reason to do so, but I'll get to it later on. Removing the pressure of the time limit is fine on its own, but I feel like there should have been another encouragement to scoring combos. For example, maybe they could replenish health, with more health being given as you lock onto more enemies at once. It's honestly a missed opportunity since, as is, the health bar is filled up by collecting rings. If there was more of a reason to care about chaining enemies, I imagine more people would enjoy the mechs since I think the combo system adds a lot to these stages. There's a certain risk-reward element here since the more targets you lock onto, the longer you're vulnerable. It's more relevant than it was in SA1 due to the aforementioned aggressive enemies. There's also the surface level satisfaction of watching a bunch of robot parts fly everywhere at once, not to mention how it gives you more to do in most of the waiting segments. The only other problem I have with the mech stages is that sometimes you'll get hit without it feeling like your own fault. This could be blamed on stuff surprising you out of nowhere, but the mobility of the mechs can also be called into question here. Compared to Gamma, the walkers are tankier with heavier jumps and slower turning. For the most part, I don't find it too offensive, especially when you have the hover ability, but when I see something fly towards me unexpectedly, suddenly I wish the mechs were able to move out of the way better. The rules for third-person shooter gameplay hadn't really been set at the time of SA2's release, but on the off chance that the mech gameplay comes back, then it would be wise to add more options like strafing or dodging. Well, despite these issues, I think these stages are overall a fun time. Finally, let's just rip off the band-aid. Big the Cat's gameplay is fishing for Froggy, which doesn't deserve to be treated as a major campaign since it's so reliant on waiting around, something that has never been very enjoyable in these games. Even by fishing mini-game standards, it's not very fun. Moving the lure is clunky and delayed, the camera angles are bad, and you might not be aware that pressing down makes it easier for the dumb frog to get attached. When you know what to do, the main campaign is almost too easy, but there are other issues that I'll bring up when it's a little more relevant. I don't know how they let this dope have more levels than Amy, and it's probably for the best that this gameplay was canned in the sequel. Now, while I don't think this needed to be an entire mandatory campaign, maybe it could have worked as some kind of optional side story. I think this could have worked since there is another prominent side activity in both adventure games that's widely beloved to this day. Yeah, that's right, the Chao Garden, one of the most popular aspects of both Sonic adventure games. If you needed Sonic to fill your virtual pet quota, then this is it. Here you can pet Chao, give them the animals and chaos stripes you collect in the main game, and watch them do various cute things. Sounds simple in theory, but there's a surprising amount of depth in practice, from moral alignments and personality traits to shop mechanics and hats your Chao can wear. Sonic Adventure 2 added even more to it, such as the addition of Chao Karate, a school for your Chao to learn new tricks, a doctor to check your Chao's stats, and more that's beyond the scope of this video. The reason I don't feel like talking about it in this video is because my endeavors to 100% both of these games have made me sorta apathetic to this side activity. To get your Chao to a sufficient level to win the races in karate required for all emblems, you have to spend a lot of time grinding chaos drives or animals in the action stages and stopping by the Chao Garden, or using a glitch to feed your Chao a single drive or animal over and over. I feel like the highest level races shouldn't have been required for all emblems and just given you benefits within the Chao Garden itself. SA2 already does the latter after all. Thankfully, both games carry over your Chao data between save slots, so I don't have to bother with a lot of that for this video. Perhaps I'll talk more about it another time if there's massive demand for it. Since I can't think of anywhere better to put this, I'll go over the boss fights briefly. For starters, both games have fights against other playable characters, and in both cases, albeit the first one more so, they're pretty pathetic and often mindless. The later ones in SE2 ramp up the challenge, but they still come off as clunky in some way. It's easy to lose track of your opponent during the Knuckles vs Rouge encounter, and both Tails vs Eggman battles are way too short to leave the impact they should. I do like the second fight between Sonic and Shadow since you'll need to change up your strategy the further the battle progresses, and it isn't too short or too long. Other than that, it just feels like they plopped in another player character controlled by a basic AI. It's a shame since I feel like SA2 demanded rival battles due to the game's structure, so to have them feel so anticlimactic is especially disappointing. That's not to say that they're a bad idea. Other Sonic games before and after have attempted rival battles to varying degrees of success, but it can be done right. Generations expands on the auto-running format used in the aforementioned Sonic vs Shadow battle, and it works well since there's actual challenge and diversity to what you're doing, especially in the silver fight. Sonic Rush also does this well, with the opposing character having attacks that are varied and tricky to dodge. Ironic considering every other boss in Rush is terrible, don't at me. Maybe that's all hindsight, but it's something that could have been improved about both adventure games. Besides the rival battles, the bosses in these games vary quite a bit. Previous Sonic games had you battling against Eggman in one of his machines, and they were typically simple battles that were mostly about how quickly you could take them down. Sonic Adventure doesn't really operate under these conceits. Only a few battles are against Eggman's mechs, and they involve a fair bit of waiting. At least the Egg Walker and Egg Viper advance their patterns as the battle goes on, making the time they take a little more justified. Besides that, SA1 also has a couple bosses against Eggman's robots. Zero and Beta Mark II are pretty solid, but the others are stupid easy. You also fight several forms of Chaos, which are all easy but inoffensive, except Chaos 4, where for all 3 times you face it, you just mindlessly jump around until it decides to pop out of the water. In Sonic Adventure 2, there are 3 boss fights against Gun's machines, and besides Flying Dog being slightly different since you have to fight it as Rouge, these feel like the same thing each time. At least they can be beaten quickly if you're skilled enough, making them feel like an evolution of the classic boss fights, which is more than I can say for the Eggmobiles, and especially Chaos 4 from the last game. But I do wish there were more unique patterns for each of these mechs. The others I think are an improvement on Sonic Adventure's selection. They make good use of the character abilities and feel pretty big in scale, and I can only think of 1 or 2 instances where there's too much waiting involved. I just wish there were more of them. For crying out loud, there are fewer normal bosses than character battles in SA2. Overall, not the best set of bosses ever, but I'm willing to cut it some slack since most platformers struggle with that. In both games, beating all the main stories unlocks a final story segment to beat. SA1's Supersonic story is pretty bare bones, involving even more trekking through the adventure field as Sonic to uncover more story bits surrounding Chaos, followed by a boss fight against Perfect Chaos as Supersonic. That's it. For what it's worth, the Perfect Chaos fight is a good way to go out, but otherwise, is this really the coming together of all the stories that they wanted? The fact that the other characters only find all the emeralds in a cutscene as opposed to being able to play as them in the destroyed Station Square is such a missed opportunity that it's painful. Where SA1 dropped the ball though, SA2 perfects the whole concept. After the stakes are raised with impending doom for the whole world, the heroes and villains come together in one final stage, Canon's Core. While the level isn't perfect, it very much serves its purpose as a final test of skill for all the characters you've been using throughout the game. Shadow is the odd one out, but he serves his role in the Bio-Lizard fight, a rather brutal boss that utilizes many elements of the speed gameplay. With the final main challenges out of the way, then you can move on to the Supersonic boss fight, and this all makes for a pretty sick ending that's worth playing the rest of the game for. I've been offering up suggestions for improvement throughout the video, but SA2's last story nailed the idea so well that short of some tweaks to the stages and bosses themselves, I've got nothing here. Not even future 3D Sonic games, besides debatably Unleashed and Black Knight, could check off all these boxes. After the story mode, there's also a bunch of optional content in both adventure games. Adventure 1 has 2 additional missions for each level, labeled as B and A. The B missions for Sonic, Tails, Amy, and Gamma all involve beating the stage with 50 or more rings. For the most part, this is just a matter of not getting hit shortly before the end of the stage, although it makes Tails' stages a little more interesting since having to collect rings means he can no longer just skip over everything. Knuckles' missions involve beating the stage without using hints, but I generally try to do that anyway considering how generous the hints are. Perhaps the most challenging are Big the Cat's B missions involving reeling in 1,000-gram fish. The A missions for most characters are some variation on do it faster, and aside from Tails' missions, which involve racing a supposedly faster Sonic, I can't tell the difference since both are just rubber bands. These are pretty fun to play. Gamma in particular benefits from this since the added time requirement means you're given more of an incentive to destroy enemies. For the other characters, it's easy to exploit since pressing restart in the pause menu boots you back to the last checkpoint rather than the beginning of the stage, but the challenge is still there, especially for Sonic and Amy. Big the Cat's A missions are the exception, making you catch a 2,000-gram fish. No exploits here, no collecting 2,000 grams across several fish. You're only beating these missions if you can reel in a single fish that weighs 2 kilograms or more. These missions have got to be some of the most infuriating gameplay I have experienced in the entire Sonic series. I had more fun A-ranking Lost Impact's hero mission than recording these 4 miserable missions. We even have a chance of a 2,000-gram fish spawning in these levels. You'll probably need all 4 of Big's lore upgrades, which are scattered across the corners of the world with little guidance. Once you've gotten them all, you can finally find 2,000-gram fish in the levels on a more consistent basis, but there's still no reliable indicator whether or not they actually do have that much weight. You'll just have to estimate based on how big they appear to be. You might think you've found one that's exactly the size you need, only for it to be 1,900 something grams. Seriously. This isn't even getting into reeling in the fish itself. It starts off by drifting off as far away from you as humanly possible, and after that you have to hope you can pull it in at just the right strength. Pull too hard and the line will break and you instantly lose the fish, but anywhere below that is an insufferably slow rate to pull such a massive fish in. Sometimes partway the fish will just decide, no, I don't think I will, and either drag the line several meters further away with practically nothing you can do about it. That sound eats away at my soul every time, or it can just get off the line entirely, forcing you to go through the whole procedure again. What are you even supposed to do about that? It's suggested that pulling the line left or right depending on the fish's movement will help get it closer, but there isn't enough feedback for this and it can sometimes be difficult to tell which direction to go due to the camera issues. The worst part is that it all seems to be a matter of luck anyways. Sometimes the mission can be over in around 3 minutes, but other times it can drag on to half an hour. Either way, it sure feels way longer than it actually is. There is one design choice surrounding this quest that will probably put a lot of people off, and that is that you have to beat each stage at least 3 times with not much done to justify this. Even if you fulfilled the B&A requirements in your first run of the stage, the game won't give you the emblems for them unless you return to the stage at some point. Find the 3 emerald pieces in less than 1 minute in Red Mountain. I already did that the first 2 times, so why do I have to do it again? That being said, while it may sound tiring to be forced to do each mission over twice after you've completed a story, I thought it was surprisingly refreshing, aside from Big's A missions. I've laid out my criticism of how some of the stories feel undercooked, only having a few short levels, but all that honestly didn't really matter to me when I was just playing the levels for the emblems. I think it only really bothered me in the main adventure mode because I spent so much time wandering through the adventure fields, have I beaten that into the ground enough yet, or watching slow cutscenes that proportionally less time was spent actually doing the things the characters are known for. Maybe I wouldn't mind the alternate playstyles being so shallow if I was only playing the levels and doing nothing more with them, and I suspect that they had the same mindset for Adventure 2. I feel like Adventure 1 was meant to be something that a player could take at their own pace, but when you're playing through a game for a video, you basically have to play through the campaign mode the way a first timer would. That's not to say the first time experience with the game isn't good. In fact, I'd go as far as saying my first playthrough of Sonic Adventure was low-key one of my favorite experiences with a video game, and it led me to consider Adventure 1 my favorite Sonic game for a while. I'm not sure if I still agree with that though, since I have to concede that playing through all stories in a row isn't really how I want to play the game from now on. The DX version also adds a mission mode where you have to find cards in the overworld and accomplish the task you're given. Most people don't talk much about it, but I figured I'd give it a skim since I did do all the missions. I appreciate how they flesh out the hub worlds with more exploration and smaller tasks to accomplish, though I wish there were hints on where the cards were even located. I think I had to look up a guide for at least one card location for each character in the game. Even something as simple as which of the 3 adventure fields the card is in would have helped me along a bit. The missions themselves are pretty basic and typically involve finding or collecting a certain number of things, although it's pretty amusing to see how far Sonic Team could stretch their assets. Would you say no to helping an old man cross the cannon-laden wings of the egg carrier? While most missions are straightforward, there are a few that are complete stinkers. Both Sonic and Tails have a mission requiring them to do something really precise on the ice cap snowboarding section, which wouldn't be so bad if they weren't placed at the very end of the stage, meaning that you have to play the entire section again if you failed. They also just couldn't resist making you catch another 2,000 gram fish, could they? Aside from stuff like that, I kinda wish this stuff was integrated into the main adventure mode rather than having a separate mission mode, if only to make the adventure fields more fleshed out. But maybe that was outside the scope of the DX port. Maybe that's for the best, since being forced to do some of the missions to move the story along might feel pointless and annoying. The DX version also adds Sonic's Game Gear library as a reward for collecting emblems and beating missions, though not in the vanilla 2010 versions for some reason, and it's honestly really novel that Sega at the time was so willing to let their old games be redistributed that they were included as bonus content in a simpler Sonic Adventure re-release. You also get a Metal Sonic skin for getting all emblems, which, thanks? Sonic Adventure 2's side content doesn't include any equivalent to the DX specific missions or Game Gear games, but it otherwise blows Sonic Adventure's post-game out of the water. For starters, at the end of the level, you're given a rank from E to A depending on your score. To be honest, I'm a little surprised that the first Sonic Adventure game didn't employ this, considering that it was used in one of Sonic Team's previous games, Nights into Dreams. In normal play, higher ranks are earned by completing the stage with a higher score, which is done by clearing the stage quickly, destroying enemies, especially the 1000-point golden gun beetle, collecting rings, and scoring other point bonuses during gameplay. Sonic and Shadow will often have to perform stunts off ramps, grind on certain rails, and do long homing attack chains on enemies. Tails and Eggman have to lock onto plenty of targets at once, and Knuckles and Rouge have to find the emeralds quickly while using hints sparsely, if at all. What's nice about this is that getting the highest rank requires skill and involvement from the player, but not necessarily perfection. Sure, using hints in the hunting stages will reduce the point bonus you get from collecting the emeralds, but even if you use a couple, getting an A is still perfectly feasible if you're fast enough. The game also only tallies ring bonuses when you're actually collecting the rings, so even if you get hit right before the end of the stage, it's still very much possible to get the A rank. Unfortunately, while the game's pretty generous with the score when it comes to taking damage, the same doesn't apply to dying outright. Besides canon score, your score will be reset to 0 when you return to the last checkpoint. This doesn't necessarily kill your rank instantly. I managed to A rank Green Force on the first attempt despite dying once after the first checkpoint, but if you accidentally lose a life when you're almost finished with this stage and therefore fail to get the A, it can be pretty grating to have to do it all over again. I'm not saying that the game shouldn't penalize dying, but knocking your score down to absolute 0 isn't how I would have done it. That's not all there is to do though, not even close. For each stage in the game, there are 4 additional missions to complete, and they have A ranks too. First up are the 100 ring missions. Unlike Sonic Adventure, these missions end as soon as you collect the ring quota, and from then you're ranked on the time it took. This is a nice gesture. Now you don't have to play through the entire stage again, and you'll have to approach the stage differently to get that A rank. The treasure hunting stages in particular are a completely different experience in this mission, since you have to chart a good route to get 100 rings as quickly as possible. It still could have been handled better though. Like with most Sonic games, you lose all of your rings on a single hit. In both adventure games, I don't have a problem with this ring system in normal play, though the game should probably have done a better job scattering them. It's weird that they just form a neat circle around you. What I have a problem with is how a single hit from an enemy that you might not have even seen coming will almost always kill your rank for this specific mission. If the ring system was altered for the second mission in some way, it would make stuff like this more palatable. Not a deal breaker in most missions, but in something like Mission Street, it can be kinda garbage. The third mission involves finding a lost Chao somewhere in the stage. To do so, you typically have to have previously found the Mystic Melody upgrade for each character. Once you have that, you need to find the Mystic Rune statue and then complete a small challenge. This encourages exploration through the levels to both find the Mystic Melody upgrade and the shrines, though the former does require some backtracking. What's nice is that this is the one mission where dying partway is unlikely to ruin your rank. Like the ring missions, these are time-based, but unlike the ring missions, you don't have to hold on to your rings. Getting the best rank is instead about spending as little time as you can reaching the shrine and completing the challenge. Fourth mission, finish in under a time limit. This mission is pretty questionable since, unlike the other side missions, you have to beat the entire stage again, but there's not enough of a difference to justify that. Getting the A rank in this mission requires a high score and not a fast clear time just like the first mission, so aside from some of the mech stages where you have to balance getting score combos with beating the clock, you're not approaching the stage in a different way. Pretty much the only real difference is that there are no checkpoints, but I usually restart the first missions whenever I die or I'm about to die anyways, since that usually ruins my rank, making the removed checkpoints in the fourth mission a bit inconsequential. Personally, I would have made these missions more like time trials where getting the A rank is based solely on time so that it feels like you're actually doing something different. Maybe even have a way to stop the clock by finding special objects or something. Heck, maybe this didn't even have to be its own mission and you'd have 2 ranks upon beating the main mission, one for score and one for time, but that's just a hypothetical. The fifth mission though, you have to play this stage again, but now the stage design itself has a higher difficulty, which is a much better justification for replaying the stage than just adding a time limit like the fourth missions. The speed and mech stages add some clever platforming challenges that'll require more focus and effort from the player as well as tougher enemies. There might be some missed potential here, there's probably some way they could have made these stages even harder, but they're nonetheless pretty rewarding to get the A rank in. The treasure hunting stages actually do something completely different. The things you need to scout for are no longer randomly placed and are now in set locations, but getting to them is more difficult. Think of having to enter a wind tunnel at the precise moment, using bombs thrown by enemies to destroy cages, using your sunglasses or treasure scope to find a specific spring, and more. Once you know how to reach these places, getting the A rank isn't too hard since it's the same deal each time you play it. You'll just have to optimize your route and not spend too much time on the tasks ahead of you. If you want more puzzle solving in these stages, then this will be right up your alley. There are other emblems in SA2 related to completing kart races or boss rushes, beating the driving missions without hitting walls or other cars, but I think you get the idea. Between the A ranks, side missions, Chao Garden multiplayer, and hidden upgrades, Sonic Adventure 2 has a ton of stuff to keep players coming back if they so desire. Now I have seen some people complain that getting all 180 emblems in Sonic Adventure 2 is a tedious drawn out process that takes too long, but I can't say that I agree. My initial plan for this video was just to get a few A ranks for footage, but I ended up getting every A rank in the game and unlocking the secret green hill level that you get for obtaining all emblems. Believe me, I wouldn't have done it if I thought it was a draining process. With the possible exceptions of the timed missions, much of the padding of SA1's completion journey is cut, and I don't feel like you replay more of these levels than you need to. Despite that, there's a ton of stuff here to sink your teeth into, and it is a commitment that will take a while, especially on your first time. Personally, I see that as a positive for those wanting to get the most out of this game. If you want something that's more replayable and arcadey, then the main campaign is always there and it's only about 4.5 hours long. While if you want something to chip away at over time, then the 100% experience will keep you coming back for more. I know that I've criticized plenty of things in Sonic Adventure 2, but I want to make it clear that revisiting it for this video has cemented in my mind that it's one of my favorite Sonic games. It's not just because of the Chao Garden or the story or even ambition or anything like that, though I do appreciate those things. No, I just think it's that fun to play. While SA1 frankly got tiring at some points during my recording, I would have been ready to go through SA2 all over again after finishing the story. I know that some people say they only enjoy the Sonic portions, but I personally don't feel like I have to make big concessions with my enjoyment of the game. I have a thoroughly fun time playing through the story mode, I think it's satisfying going for the A ranks and playing the alternate missions, and I like pretty much everything in between. It's the one 3D Sonic game that, in my opinion, fully recreates and even surpasses that feeling of endless replayability that the classics provided. Even still, there is definitely still room for improvement in the ways that I've listed. There are still aspects of the levels and controls that feel rough around the edges even for the time, and it had to completely leave behind some of the things people liked about the first adventure game. This stuff bothers me less the more I play it, but I can remember some of these issues bothering me on my first playthrough. I'd imagine that a follow-up to Adventure 2 could smooth over those rough edges and possibly even bring back and refine some aspects of the first adventure game. This, above all else, is why I don't believe we have ever gotten a true Sonic Adventure 3. I look at games like Sonic Heroes, Shadow the Hedgehog, and Sonic 06, but to me, none of them feel like the next step after Sonic Adventure 2. They all just happen to share some similarities with the two adventure games before them, perhaps more so than any 3D Sonic game after them. I would expect Sonic Adventure 3 to be to the adventure games what Sonic 3 and Knuckles was to the classic games. A game that seems absolutely uncompromised in its endeavor to make a game that's simultaneously larger and more streamlined than its predecessors. I'd love to play that game someday, but I guess it remains to be seen if it will actually ever become real. For now, all I can reasonably hope for is that future games try their hardest to be big, thrilling experiences that take the series to new heights and will be worth revisiting years later, just like the adventure games were, but that too waits to be seen. And there we have it, the elusive video on the Sonic Adventure games. Jeez, to quote Rouge, I guess I took a little too much time, but I really didn't want to disappoint with this one. If you weren't disappointed, then consider leaving a like, and if you're interested in some of my other stuff, then you may want to subscribe and or check out my older content. I've also created Twitter and Twitch accounts since the last video in case you're curious, and the links for those will be in the description. Thank you for watching if you've made it this far. Thank you all for the unthinkable support I've received in the last few months, and rest easy, heroes.